All right, everyone, welcome back. Great to be here. Stay fine. Stay everybody understand what I'm saying? Good. All right. Marvelous. Well, since Kevin gave a commercial before the last talk, that's what I'll do right now. I'm going to introduce him, but I first have to give a commercial for a couple of interesting items that you will find at the American Chesterton Society table out there. First of all, very thick and heavy tome subject if you're interested in it. Chesterton and the Jews, it just came out a few months ago. Excellent, thorough debunking of that accusation against our friend Chesterton. But also, and more interesting, I think, is a book that's going to come out in about a week. It's being printed even as we speak. The first biography ever written of Frances Chesterton, G.K.'s wife. And if you get it today, and today only, and not just, this is just for you, it's not for anybody else, it's for you, just between us right now, just today, only today. We'll send it to you for free, no shipping charges. Buy it today, pre-order it today, right here, upstairs at this table. Just today only, free shipping, all right? If you buy it through some other means, you're going to have to pay for the shipping. I'm just telling you, you're going to pay for the shipping. If you want to pay for the shipping, buy it some other way. It's fine. If you want free shipping, buy it today from me, okay? All right. Kevin O'Brien is one of the most interesting and entertaining, certainly articulate, quick-witted, and enjoyable people that I have the privilege of knowing. I have a great difficulty of introducing him now because I'm not introducing him. I'm introducing someone else. Some guy named J.R.R. Tolkien, author of Lord of the Hobbit, creator of the Middle Ear, and he's going to do this wham-up job on fairy tales, and that's what you're going to. So don't just forget everything you know about Kevin O'Brien. He's not even here. Instead, you have this famous English author who's going to favor you right now. Please welcome J.R.R. Tolkien.
Thank you. I propose to speak about fairy stories, though I am aware that this is a rash adventure. Fairy is a perilous realm, and in it are pitfalls for the unwary and dungeons for the overbold. But please bear with me in this lecture as I prepare to be perhaps somewhat overbold. Fairy stories on the whole have three faces: the mystical towards the supernatural, the magical towards nature, and the mirror of scorn and pity towards man. In addition, the realm of fairies, wide and deep and high, and is filled with all things. All manner of beasts and birds are found there, shoreless seas and stars uncounted, beauty that is an enchantment and an ever-present peril, both joy and sorrow, as sharp as swords. Into that realm a man may perhaps count himself fortunate to have wandered, but its very richness and strangeness tie the tongue of a traveler who would report them. And while he is there, it is dangerous for him to ask too many questions, lest the gates should be shut and the keys lost. There are, however, some questions that one who is to speak about fairy stories must expect to answer, or attempt to answer, whatever the folk of fairyland may think of his impertinence. For instance, 1, what are fairy stories? 2, what is their origin? And 3, what is the use of them? I will try to give answers to these questions, or such answers to them as I have gleaned. Let us begin with the question, what are fairy stories? I answer that they are not stories about particular elves or fairies, but about fairyland, the perilous realm itself, and the air that blows in that country. They are about the realm or state in which fairies have their being. Fairyland contains many things besides elves and fays, besides dwarves, witches, trolls, giants, and dragons. It holds the seas, the sun, the moon, the sky, the earth, and all things in it, tree and bird, water and stone, wine and bread, and ourselves, mortal men, when we are enchanted. I will speak more about enchantment later, but first, if we are to be clear about what fairy stories are, we also have to be clear about what they are not. There are many stories which are considered fairy tales which should not be considered so because they are not about the perilous realm. Gulliver's Voyage to Lilliput, for instance, is often included in collections of fairy stories for no good reason other than the fact that the Lilliputians are small, even diminutive, the only way in which they are at all remarkable. But smallness is, in the realm of fairy, as in our world, only an accident. Pygmies are no nearer to fairies than are Patagonians. Tales that deal with the strangeness of the unenchanted earth, however unique or clever, like Gulliver's Travels, are travelers' tales, and I would exclude them from the category of fairy stories. Next to travelers' tales, I would also exclude any story that uses the machinery of dream, the dreaming of actual human sleep, to explain the apparent occurrence of its marvels. A real dream may indeed be a fairy story of almost elvish ease and skill while it is being dreamed, but if a waking writer tells you that his tale is a thing imagined in his sleep, he cheats deliberately the primal desire at the heart of fairyland, the realization, independent of the conceiving mind, of imagined wonder. For it is essential to a genuine fairy story that it should be presented as true. The meaning of true in this connection I will consider later, but first, since the fairy story deals with marvels, it cannot tolerate any frame or machinery suggesting that the whole story in which they occur is a figment or illusion. Fairyland may be an enchanted land, but in the context of the story, it is real. As to the question, what is the origin of fairy stories? I think it is more important, and also in its way more difficult, to consider what they are, what they have become for us, and what values the long alchemic processes of change have produced in them, than it is to speculate about their origins. In Dasent's words, I would say, we must be satisfied with the soup that is set before us, and not desire to see the bones of the ox out of which it has been boiled. I shall therefore pass lightly over the question of origins, except to note that the history of fairy stories is probably more complex than the history of the human race, and as complex as the history of language. Three things: independent invention, inheritance, and diffusion have evidently played their part in producing the intricate web of story. It is now beyond all skill but that of the elves to unravel it. Of these three, inheritance, which is borrowing in time, diffusion, which is borrowing in space, and invention, which is storycraft, but more than that. Of these three, invention is the most important and fundamental, and so not surprisingly, also the most mysterious. To an inventor, that is, to a story maker, the other two must in the end turn back. Philology, too, has its role to play in the development of fairy stories, for language and its history cannot be ignored. The incarnate mind, the tongue, and the tale are in our world coeval. The human mind, endowed with the powers of generalization and abstraction, sees not only green grass, distinguishing it from other things and finding it fair to look upon, but also sees that it is green, as well as being grass. But how powerful, how stimulating to the very faculty which produced it was the invention of the adjective. No spell or incantation in fairyland is more potent. And this is not surprising, for such incantations may only be seen as another view of adjectives, a part of speech in a mythical grammar. The mind that thought of the adjectives light, heavy, grey, yellow, still, swift, also conceived magic to make heavy things light and able to fly, to turn grey lead into yellow gold, or the still rock into a swift water. If it could do one, it could do the other. It inevitably did both. You see, when we can take green from grass, blue from heaven, red from blood, we have already an enchanter's power upon one plane, and the desire to wield that power in the world external to our minds awakes. It does not follow that we shall use that power well upon any plane. We may put a deadly green upon a man's face and produce a horror. We may make the rare and terrible blue moon to shine, or cause woods to spring with silver leaves, or rams to wear fleeces of gold, or put hot fire into the belly of the cold worm, making the dragon. But in such fantasy, as it is called, new form is made. Fairyland begins. Man, the story maker, becomes a sub-creator. I will now turn to the third and most important of the three questions. What, if any, are the values and functions of fairy stories now? Are they to be read and enjoyed merely by children, or may they be enjoyed by adults as well? And if enjoyed by adults, what is the nature of this enjoyment? Is it frivolous and so-called escapist, or is there something more serious and even mystical in the tales of the perilous realm? To answer that question, let us consider another question. What happens when we hear or read a compelling story? Any compelling story. What happens when we are drawn in? That state of mind has often been called willing suspension of disbelief, but I do not think this to be a good description of what happens. What really happens is the story maker proves a successful sub-creator. He makes a secondary world that your mind can enter. Inside it, what he relates is true. It accords with the laws of that world. The moment, while you're in it, you therefore believe it. But the moment disbelief arises, the spell, or rather the art, is broken. You are then out in the primary world again, looking at the little abortive secondary world from the outside. If you are obliged by kindness or circumstance to stay, then disbelief must be suspended or stifled, otherwise listening and looking would become intolerable. Thus, this suspension of disbelief is a substitute for the genuine thing, or a subterfuge that we use when condescending to games or make-believe. I will give you an example. You have baseball in this country. We have cricket where I'm from. A real enthusiast for cricket, when watching a game, is in the enchanted state, secondary belief. When I watch a match, am on the lower level. I can achieve more or less willing suspension of disbelief when I am held there and supported by some other motive that will keep away boredom. For instance, a wild heraldic preference for the dark blue uniforms of Team A rather than the light blue uniforms of Team B. Thus, this suspension of disbelief may be a somewhat tired, shabby, sentimental state of mind, but I fancy it is often the state of adults in the presence of a fairy story. They are held there and supported by sentiment, memories of childhood, or notions of what childhood ought to be like. They think they ought to like the tale, but if they really liked it for itself, they would not have to suspend disbelief. They would believe in that sense. You see, when I was a child, I had no special will to believe. I wanted to know. Belief depended upon the way in which stories were presented to me by older people or by the authors, or on the inherent tone and quality of the tale. But at no time do I recall that enjoyment of a story was dependent upon belief that such things could happen or had happened in real life. Because fairy stories were not primarily about possibility, but about desirability. If they awakened desire, satisfying it while whetting it almost unendurably, they succeeded. It is not necessary to be more explicit here, for I hope to say something later about this desire, a complex of many things. Some universal, some particular to modern men, including modern children, some even to certain kinds of men. For instance, I had no desire to have dreams or adventures like Alice, and the amount of them merely amused me. I had very little desire to hunt for buried treasure or to fight pirates. Treasure Island left me cool. Red Indians were better, for there were bows and arrows. I had and have a wholly unsatisfied desire to shoot well with a bow, and strange languages and glimpses of an archaic mode of life, and above all, forests in such stories. But the land of Merlin and Arthur were better than these. And best of all was the nameless north of Sigurd and the Volsungs and the prince of all dragons. Such lands were preeminently desirable. Now, I never imagined that the dragon was of the same order as the horse, and this is not solely because I saw horses daily, but never even the footprint of a worm. The dragon had the trademark of fairyland written plain upon him. In whatever world he had his being, it was an other world. Fantasy, the making or glimpsing of other worlds, was the heart of the desire of fairyland. And I desired dragons with a profound desire. Of course, I, in my timid body, did not wish to have them in the neighborhood, intruding into my relatively safe existence, in which, for instance, it was possible to read stories in peace of mind, free from fear. But the world that included even the imagination of Fafnir was richer and more beautiful at whatever cost of peril. For the heart is hard and courageous, though the body be soft and cowardly, and the dweller in the quiet and fertile plains may hear tell of the troubled hills and unharvested sea, and long for them in his heart as I did. Now, I have said perhaps more than enough on this subject, but at least it will be plain that in my opinion, I do not think that fairy stories should be especially associated with children. I do not deny that there is a truth in Andrew Lang's words, sentimental though they may be. He who would enter into the kingdom of fairy must have the heart of a little child. For having the heart of a little child is necessary to all high venture into kingdoms both less and far greater than the realm of fairy. Very well then. If adults are to read and enjoy fairy stories as a natural branch of literature, then what are the values and functions of this kind? That, I think, is the last and most important question. I have already hinted at some of my answers. First of all, if written with art, the prime value of fairy stories is that value which they share with other literary forms. But fairy stories offer also, in a peculiar degree or mode, these things. 1, fantasy. 2, recovery. 3, escape. And 4, and most mysteriously, consolation. I will now speak about these 4, and I will begin with fantasy. Fantasy is, as I think, not a lesser but a higher art form, indeed, the most nearly pure form so that when successful, also the most potent. Of course, fantasy starts out with an advantage, arresting strangeness. But this advantage has been turned against it and has contributed to its disrepute. There are many people who dislike being arrested. They dislike any meddling with the primary world, or such glimpses of it as are familiar to them, and they therefore stupidly and even maliciously confound fantasy with dreaming, in which there is no art, or with mental disorders, in which there is not even control, with delusion and hallucination. But this error or malice engendered by disquiet and consequent dislike is not the sole cause of the confusion, for fantasy has also an essential drawback. It is difficult to achieve. Fantasy may be, as I think, not a less but a higher art form, but it is often found that the inner consistency of reality is more difficult to produce in fantasy. It is easier to produce this reality with more sober material. Fantasy thus too often remains undeveloped. It has been used frivolously or only half seriously, or merely for decoration. It remains merely fanciful. Anyone inheriting the fantastic device of human language can say, "the green sun." Many can then imagine or picture it, but that is not enough. To make a secondary world inside which the green sun is credible, commanding secondary belief, will probably require labor and thought, and will certainly demand special skill, a kind of elvish craft. Few attempt such difficult tasks, but when they are attempted and in any degree accomplished, we have a rare achievement in art, indeed narrative art, in its primary and most potent mode. Now, in human art, fantasy is a thing best left to true literature, that is, to words. In painting, for instance, the visual depiction of the fantastic image is technically too easy. The hand tends to outrun the mind, even to overthrow it. Silliness and morbidity are frequent results. It is also a misfortune that drama, which is entirely distinct from literature, is an art that has been considered together with it or as a branch of it. For drama is naturally hostile to fantasy. Men dressed up as talking animals may achieve buffoonery or mimicry, but they cannot achieve fantasy. The reason for this is, of course, partly due to the fact that the producers of drama have to, or try to, work with mechanism to represent either fantasy or magic. For instance, I once saw the so-called children's pantomime, The Straight Story of Puss in Boots, with even the transformation of the ogre into a mouse. Had this been mechanically successful, it would either have terrified the spectators, or else have been just a high-class turn of conjuring. As it was, though done with some ingenuity of lighting, disbelief had not so much to be suspended as hanged, drawn, and quartered. A reason I think more important than the inadequacy of stage effects is this. Fantasy has already achieved a kind of bogus, or shall I say at least substitute magic, the visual and audible presentation of imaginary men in a story. The radical difference between all art, including drama, that offers a visual presentation, and true literature is that it imposes one visible form. Literature works from mind to mind, and is thus more progenitive. It is at once more universal and more poignantly particular. If it speaks of stone or tree or bread or wine, it appeals to the whole of these things, to their ideas, yet the hearer will give them some peculiar personal embodiment in his imagination. Should a story say, he ate bread, the dramatic producer or painter can only show a piece of bread, according to his taste or fancy. But the hearer of the story will think of bread in general, and will picture it in some form of his own. If a story says he climbed a hill and saw a river in the valley below, the illustrator may catch, or nearly catch, his own vision of such a scene, but every hearer of the words will have his own picture of it, and that picture will include every hill, every river, every dale that he has ever seen, but especially the hill, the river, the valley, which were for him the first embodiment of the word. For this precise reason, that the characters and even the scenes in drama are not imagined but actually beheld. Drama is, though it uses similar material, words, verse, plot, and art fundamentally different from narrative art. If you prefer drama to literature, as many literary critics plainly do, or form your critical theories from dramatic critics or even from drama, you are apt to misunderstand pure story making and to constrain it to the limitations of stage plays. You are, for instance, liable to prefer characters, even the basest and dullest, to things. Very little of trees as trees can be got into a play. Now, fairy and drama, those plays which, according to abundant records, the elves have often presented to men, can produce fantasy with a realism and immediacy beyond the compass of any human machinery. As a result, their usual effect upon a man is to go beyond secondary belief. If you are to find yourself present at a fairy drama, a drama produced by elves, you yourself are, or think that you are, bodily inside its secondary world. The experience is very similar to dreaming, and has, it would seem, sometimes by men being confounded with it. But in fairy and drama, you are inside a dream that some other mind is weaving, and the awareness of this alarming fact may slip from your grasp. To experience directly a secondary world is a potion too strong, and you give to it primary belief. However marvelous the events, you are deluded. Whether that is the intention of the elves, always or at any time, is another question. They, at least themselves, are not deluded. We need a word for this elvish craft, but all the words that have been associated with it have been blurred and confused with other things. Magic is ready to hand, but magic should be reserved for the operation of the magician. I prefer the word enchantment. Enchantment produces a secondary world inside which both designer and spectator can enter to the satisfaction of their senses while they are inside. But in its purity, it is artistic in design and purpose. Magic, by contrast, produces or pretends to produce an alteration in the primary world. It does not matter by whom it is said to be practiced, fey or mortal. Magic remains not an art, but a technique. Its desire is power in this world, the domination of things and winds. To this elvish craft, enchantment, fantasy aspires, and when it is successful, it is one of the most potent forms of literary art. Unlike magic, fantasy does not seek delusion, nor bewitchment and domination, but shared enrichment. Partners in making and delight, not slaves. To many, though, fantasy, this sub-creative art which plays such tricks with the world, combining nouns and redistributing adjectives, has seemed suspect, if not illegitimate. Some people think that it is only a thing for children, for peoples or persons in their youth. As to its legitimacy, I will merely quote from a letter I once wrote to a man who called myth and fairy stories lies. Though to do him justice, he was kind enough and confused enough to call fairy story making breathing a lie through silver. This man was my friend Jack. You know him as C.S. Lewis. I will now read to you a poem that I wrote to him after our long night talk. Dear sir, I said, although now long estranged, man is not wholly lost, nor wholly changed. Disgraced he may be, yet is not dethroned, and keeps the rags of lordship once he owned. Man, sub-creator, the refracted light through whom is splintered from a single white to many hues and endlessly combined in living shapes that move from mind to mind. Though all the crannies of the world we filled with elves and goblins, though we dared to build gods and their houses out of dark and light, and sowed the seeds of dragons, 'twas our right, used or misused. That right has not decayed. We make still by the law in which we are made. You see, fantasy remains a human right. It neither attacks nor distorts the reason. It neither blunts the appetite for nor obscures the appreciation of scientific verity. On the contrary, the keener and clearer is the mind, the better fantasy will it make. Fantasy can, of course, be carried to extremes. It can be ill done. It can even be put to evil uses. It can even delude the minds out of which it came. But of what human thing in this fallen world is that not true? Men have created not only elves, but they have imagined gods and worshipped them, and worshipped even those most deformed by their author's own evil. But men have made false gods out of other material. Their notions, their monies, their banners, even their social and economic theories and science have demanded human sacrifice. But the abuse of a thing does not invalidate its proper use. We make in our measure and in our derivative mode because we are made, and not only made, but made in the image and likeness of a maker. But we makers who are made live in a tired and cynical age. We have grown ill and we need recovery. We should look at green again and be startled anew by blue and yellow and red. We should meet the centaur and the dragon, and then perhaps suddenly see, like the ancient shepherds, sheep and dogs and horses and wolves. This recovery, fairy stories help us to make. In that sense, only a taste for them may make us or keep us childish. Recovery, which is a return and a regaining of health, a renewal, is a regaining of a clear view. We need to clean our windows so that the things seen clearly may be freed from the drab blur of triteness and familiarity. For this triteness is really the penalty of appropriation. The things that we have that have become trite or in a bad sense familiar are things we have appropriated legally or mentally. We say we know them. They are like the things which once attracted us by their glitter or their color or their shape, and we laid hands on them and then locked them in our hoard, acquired them, and acquiring them ceased to look at them. Of course, fairy stories are not the only means of recovery. Humility is enough, and there is, especially for the humble, Moorfolk or Chestertonian fantasy. Moorfolk, Mooreeffoc, is a fantastic word, but it can be seen written up in every town in this land. It is a coffee room, viewed from the inside through a glass door, backwards, as it was seen by Dickens on a dark London day, and it was used by Chesterton to connote the queerness of things that had become trite, seen suddenly from a new angle, which becomes the gateway to recovery. Now, I have spoken on two of the four aspects that I mentioned: fantasy and recovery. I will now conclude by speaking on the final two: escape, and the most mysterious of all, consolation, which are, of course, closely connected. Though fairy stories are by no means the only medium of escape, they are one of the most obvious and to some outrageous forms of so-called escapist literature. It is thus necessary to attach to a consideration of them some consideration of use of the term escape and criticism generally. I've claimed that escape is one of the main functions of fairy stories, and since I do not disapprove of them, it is plain that I do not accept the term of scorn and pity with which the word escape is today so often used by literary critics. We are faced by a misuse of words and by a confusion of thought. Why should a man be scorned if, finding himself in prison, he tries to get out and go home? Or if, when he cannot do so, he thinks and talks about other topics than jailers and prison walls? The world outside has not become less real because the prisoner cannot see it. In using escape in this way, the critics have chosen the wrong word. And what is more, they are confusing, not always by sincere error, the escape of the prisoner with the flight of the deserter. Just so, a party spokesman might have labeled departure from the misery of the Führers or any other Reich, and even criticism of it, as treachery. And if we leave aside for the moment fantasy, I do not think that the reader or maker of fairy stories need even be ashamed of the so-called escape of archaism, of preferring not dragons, but horses, castles, sailing ships, bows and arrows, preferring not only elves, but knights and kings and priests. For it is, after all, possible for a reasonable man, after some reflection, quite unconnected with fairy story or romance, to arrive at the condemnation of progressive things like factories, or the machine guns and bombs that appear to be their most natural and inevitable, dare we say inexorable, products. It is part of the essential malady of such days, producing the desire to escape, not indeed from life, but from our present age and self-made misery, that we are acutely conscious both of the ugliness of our works and of their evil, so that to us, evil and ugliness seem indissolubly allied. We have difficulty imagining evil and beauty together. The fear of the beautiful fae that ran through the elder ages almost eludes our grasp, but even more alarming. Today, goodness is bereft of its proper beauty. In fairyland, one can indeed conceive of an ogre who possesses a castle hideous as a nightmare because the evil of the ogre wills it so, but one cannot conceive of a house built with a good purpose, an inn, a hostel for travelers, the hall of a noble and virtuous king that is yet sickeningly ugly. But at the present day, it would be rash to hope to find one that was not, unless it was built before our time. And so there are frustrations in the primary world and in the secondary world of fairyland. But there are also consolations, including the most mysterious consolation of all, the joy of the happy ending. Almost, I would assert, that all complete fairy stories must have it. At least I would say that tragedy is the true form of drama, its highest function. But the opposite is true of fairy stories. Since we do not appear to possess a word that expresses this opposite, I will use the word eucatastrophe. E-U-C-A-T-A-S-T-R-O-P-H-E, eucatastrophe. The eucatastrophic tale is the true form of fairy tale and its highest function. The consolation of fairy stories, the joy of the happy ending, or more correctly, of the good catastrophe. This joy, this sudden joyous turn, for there is no true end to any fairy story. This joy is one of the things that fairy stories can produce supremely well. In its fairy tale or otherworld setting, it is not essentially escapist or fugitive. It is a sudden, miraculous grace, never to be counted on to recur. It does not deny the existence of discatastrophe, of suffering and failure, for the presence of these is necessary to the joy of deliverance. It denies, against much evidence, if you will, ultimate, final defeat. And insofar, it is evangelium, giving a fleeting glimpse of joy, joy beyond the walls of the world, poignant as grief. It is a mark of a good fairy story, of the higher or more complete kind, that however wild its events, however fantastic or terrible its adventures, it can give to child or man that hears it, when the sudden joyous turn in the story comes, a catch of the breath, a beat and lifting of the heart, near to or indeed accompanied by tears as keen as that given by any form of literary art. Even modern fairy stories can produce this effect sometimes. It is not an easy thing to do. It depends on the whole story that is the setting of the turn. And yet, in such stories, when the sudden turn comes, we get a piercing glimpse of joy and heart's desire that for the moment passes outside the frame, rends indeed the very web of story, and lets a gleam come through. 7 long years I served for thee, the glassy hill I clammed for thee, the bloody shirt I rang for thee. And wilt thou not waken and turn to me? He heard and turned to her. The peculiar quality of the joy of successful fantasy is not merely a consolation for the sorrows of this world, but a satisfaction and an answer to that question, is it true? The answer to this question, which I gave earlier, was quite rightly, if you have built your little world well, yes, it is true in that world. That is enough for the artist, or the artist part of the artist. But in the eucatastrophe, we see in a brief gleam or vision that the answer may be greater. It may be a glimpse of evangelium in the real world. Evangelium, I've used that word twice now. It means good news, gospel. And with the use of this word, I give a hint to my epilogue and to the mysterious conclusion of my lecture. For I would venture to say that in approaching the Christian story from this direction that has long been my feeling, a joyous feeling, that God redeemed the corrupt making creatures, men, in a way fitting to this aspect as to other aspects of their strange nature. You see, the Gospels contain a fairy story, or a story of a larger kind, which embraces all the essence of fairy stories. They contain many marvels, peculiarly artistic, beautiful, and moving, and among the marvels is the greatest and most complete conceivable eucatastrophe, happy ending, sudden joyous turn, unmerited surprising grace. The birth of Christ is the eucatastrophe of man's history. The resurrection is the eucatastrophe of the story of the incarnation. This story begins and ends in joy. It has preeminently the inner consistency of reality. There is no tale ever told that men would rather find was true, and none which so many skeptical men have accepted as true on its own merits, for the art of it has the supremely convincing tone of primary art, that is, of creation. To reject it leads either to sadness or to wrath. And it would not be difficult to imagine the peculiar excitement or joy one would feel if any specially beautiful fairy story were found to be primarily true in the real world, its narrative to be history, without thereby necessarily losing the mythical and allegorical significance it had possessed. The joy we would feel would have exactly the same quality, if not the same degree, as that joy which the turn of a fairy story gives. The Christian joy, the Gloria, is of the same kind, but it is preeminently high and joyous. The Christian story is supreme and it is true. Art has been verified. God is the Lord of angels and of men and of elves. With Christ, legend and history have met and fused. But in God's kingdom, the presence of the greatest does not depress the less. Redeemed man is still man. Story, fantasy still go on and should go on. The Evangelium has not abrogated legends, it has hallowed them, especially the happy ending. The Christian has still to work, with mind as well as body, to suffer, hope, and die. But he may now perceive that all his bents and faculties have a purpose, which can be redeemed. So great is the bounty with which he has been treated, that he may now perhaps fairly dare to guess that in fantasy we may actually assist in the affoliation and multiple enrichment of creation. And yet, it is beyond our capacity to fully understand. But all tales may come true. And in the end, redeemed, they may be as like and unlike the forms that we now give them, as man himself redeemed may be as like and unlike the fallen that we know. God bless you all and thank you.